Among the authors we're reading in this course, Henry Kuttner is a bit of an odd duck, both in terms of his background, his stylistics, and also the fact that he died very young. His dates, 1915 to 1958, he actually died of a heart attack. So, however, despite his fairly short life, he was extremely prolific. He was a close friend of Robert Bloch. In the archive, there's actually a photo of Bloch and Kuttner together while relatively young, in which Kuttner is pushing Bloch around in a wheelchair. So, he was the son of a bookseller in Los Angeles, grew up in relative poverty, in greater part largely self-educated, particularly in terms of his writing. He had very little formal training. He had actually gone back and was finishing up his master's degree when he died. Throughout the course of his life, he sponsored a number of other writers, was great friends with Richard Matheson, who wrote I Am Legend, who, in the foreword to one of his novels, thanked Kuttner for his encouragement, support, and editing. Ray Bradbury famously said that Kuttner actually wrote the last 300 words of his first novel. When Bradbury himself was stuck, Kuttner volunteered to step in and help him finish it. This kind of collaboration with other authors also carries over into his collaboration with his wife, C.L. Moore. She had her own independent writing career, but these two were extremely prolific together. She frequently claimed that one of the reasons they wrote so frequently together is the fact that Henry had a much higher page count than she did. He could generate more text than she could. Elsprey de Camp, who is another author, I don't believe we're reading de Camp in this course, who was friends with both of them, at one time made almost a joke of the fact that when they were both working on a project, one could step away from the typewriter with the paper still loaded, with a sentence half finished. The other could slide in, finish the sentence, and keep the manuscript rolling, and they would simply change places periodically until the project was completed. The general output of a number of their collaborations, some science fiction, some which bordered on romance. Moore was not particularly enraptured with horror the way Kuttner was. However, we do have a very well-preserved record of their collaborations together. Unlike some of the other authors we're reading for this course, where the number of pseudonyms and the number of ghost writings and silent collaborations interferes with how much work they actually did over the course of their life. Kuttner's work is actually fairly easy to trace. So, over the course of his life, he produced 24 short stories, at least 18 novels, several of which in collaboration with his wife. He wrote for film and television. He was particularly prolific in TV. A number of the series for which he wrote were never actually picked up by the networks, but he kept trying. More interestingly, Kuttner wrote literally dozens of comic books. He either solely authored or co-authored a number of storylines, particularly in the 40s and the 50s. So, did a little bit of everything. Kind of a fun guy. Which brings us back to the readings for this class, the Salem Horror. What we have in the Salem Horror is another homage piece. Another piece which shows how the author plays with the pulp tropes, with the generic expectations of the medium. There's not really a whole lot to say about that piece, unfortunately. I don't think that it's Kuttner's best. It's a very good story. It's very tightly written, and it's definitely part of the mythos. But in some ways, we're seeing elements that others may have done better. Part of the reason I wanted to include this particular piece here is both as an introduction to Henry Kuttner, whose other work I think is absolutely fascinating, also to show how these tropes change, how they get shifted. We have to remember that when this piece appears in 1937, we're right in the hot spot for pulp publishing. Things have not quite yet begun to decline, as they will as World War II approaches and throughout the war years, as tastes shift away from horror. And many of the authors we're reading over the course of the course are at the peak of their powers. Clark Ashton Smith. Derleth is getting started. Robert Bloch is churning right along. Frank Belknap Long is banging stories out every week. So, we're seeing Kuttner kind of playing at the peak. And then the decline starts. But that's a tale for another time. So, Henry Kuttner. Love him? Hate him? Meh? I'm interested in hearing what you say. Please, please, please consider posting about Kuttner in the discussion boards. Because again, we're looking at adaptation, adoption, and modification in terms of this particular story. If we had access to a few other Henry Kuttner pieces to compare, I think you would see the tonal and stylistic shifts which occur particularly later in Kuttner's career when he still remains true to horror to a point, but it starts to take some different forms. It starts to mutate, particularly in the 40s. So if you have time, read more Kuttner. If not, enjoy.